I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.
All right, Lee, we've been talking about, the last couple of podcasts have been Ming-Qing Dynasty stories. We're talking about something a little different, a little more modern this week, which is what?
It's A.Q. Zhengzhuang.
By
the most famous writer in all of modern Chinese literature, at least according to Chinese authorities.
On the mainland.
That's Lu Xun.
Lu Xun. It is difficult to overestimate how important Lu Xun is for mainland Chinese cultural critics, readers, people in general. When I was teaching there, I had a whole series. I did a lot of different classes, like a lot of different groups. And
Rob's done a lot of things.
I've been around.
Some of them I'm
a big deal.
Yeah.
You know, I'm a super big deal. You just go to China and ask him. Just walk into a market. Do you know Rob Moore? Oh yeah, totally. And one of the activities I did in a lot of the English classes was I made a list of 10 Chinese people. Everybody from Jackie Chan to Qin Huangdi, the first emperor. And I asked them to rate who's the greatest, who's the least great of these 10. Lu Xun was one of the people I put on the list. Every group of 3 or 4 students in every class put Lu Xun in the top 3. Most, number 1 or 2. And this is lists that include people like Confucius, the first emperor, Mao Zedong, and Lu Xun was always in the top 3. Does he deserve to be there? That's a question that divides a lot of people. Lee and I, like for example, Lee, how well received is Lu Xun in Taiwan?
Taiwan, he's almost not known. No one reads him. Now, part of the reason for that is because it was illegal to read Lu Xun until probably the 90s.
Which is why?
It was a political reason. Taiwan was, of course, controlled by the KMT until 2000. The Kuomintang until the year 2000. And for much of that period, they were dictatorial. They ruled via martial law. And because Lu Xun was associated with leftists, and particularly communists, the KMT, who was a rightist party who was defeated by the communists, was not really happy to hear people reading about him. And if you were caught reading him, you might get an all expenses paid trip to the Green Island jail.
Well, and it's interesting because the more you read and study Lu Xun, the more perplexing and I think interesting he is, because in Taiwan, and I believe in Hong Kong too, he's sort of positioned as a sort of socialist communist sympathizer, but he never actually joined the Communist Party. He was deeply sympathetic to socialist principles, but never actually formally committed to those.
I've heard, and I'm not sure this is true, that I think I'm getting this from C.T. Xia, who is not a reliable source on Lu Xun.
Although a fascinating critic. Xia being spelled H-S-I-A, in case you want to look him up.
He's the guy who essentially created modern Chinese literature. He wrote the book.
As a study, yeah.
He wrote the book literally on modern Chinese literature. Yeah. But he was also very much anti-communist.
Yes.
And he hated Lu Xun. But he, I believe, said that Lu Xun didn't join the party because it was too leftist, or it was not sufficiently leftist. I'm sorry. It was not sufficiently leftist of an organization. So it seems kind of like a weird reason.
I guess that's always possible. What's fascinating, though, is he never seems to commit to any one thing. And I think, you'll get a story like this that seems very, which we'll talk about in just a second, which is very much it's positioned as this great revolutionary story, but when you read it, it's very complex and not nearly that easy to peg. And then within less than a decade, he's writing something like Wild Grass, Yetal, which is deeply complicated.
And one thing I do love about Lu Xun, and this story in particular, is there is in China a communist-approved interpretation of this story that is assigned to it, and you're not supposed to have any other feelings about it. When I read it as someone who lives in, I'm going to say it, a free country.
Freaking elitist, bourgeois.
When I read it, I find it much more fascinating than those kind of state-approved interpretations allow for.
Yes.
He's not a hack. You can accuse Lu Xun of a lot of things, but he's not a hack. Mm-hmm. He's not writing for the communists. He's writing very complicated works for himself. He has a perspective, but what that perspective is, I don't know that I necessarily, like, I don't come to an end when I read him again and again. I don't say, like, oh yeah, this is the same thing that I read last time. Each time I pick it up, it's something new, which is a sign of good, maybe great literature.
I would agree, great. In fact, the first time I read the story, which was in English, I thought it was crap. Yeah. Partly that's because it's so clunky and weird in English.
Let me ask you.
Yes.
All translations in mainland China into English are pretty much by people who can't speak English, I find. Is that the case?
That's largely the case. I think I've read it.
I think I had that same Lu Xun translation.
But you end up like, okay, so when I read the story the first time, when Lu Xun, or when Aq speaks, the character is named Aq. We'll talk about that again in a second, too.
No, let's go ahead and get into it.
Just in English, it's really clunky and weird. But when you read it in Chinese...
It's so revolutionary.
He sounded to me like a taxi driver. Like, having been in the mainland by then about 5 years, as soon as I read the stuff he was saying, I was like, oh my goodness, the register, everything he says sounds it's spot on. It's hilarious. So, let's just give a quick plot summary.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Aq, which in Chinese has the Chinese character for A, which is an automatopoeia. It doesn't actually mean anything. And then the English letter Q, and that's even what starts the story, is essentially the story of a guy named Aq. He's called Aq largely because no one actually knows what he's called.
Right, which is important to the story.
This is important to the story. The letter Q, the English letter Q is put in as sort of a placeholder for who knows how many different kinds of possibilities in Chinese. He lives in a village whose name in Chinese is Weizhuang, which literally means nothing village, like nowhere, nothingville, like the Elvis song. Yeah. In fact, Lu Xun may have been talking about Elvis. Who knows?
Elvis may have been talking about Lu Xun. I think that's more.
This was his ode to Lu Xun. Who knew it? Who knew he was so well read? And so essentially, the first about half to 2/3 of the story is Aq in this village behaving like a complete lowlife moron. And I use the word moron advisedly. Yeah. Like, he also gets in various fights, one of which is with a beggar covered in lice, which he loses, of course, the fight that is. And then much later in the story, he gets in a fight with another character whose name is Xiao D. Xiao, Chinese character for little, English letter D.
Xiao D is almost a doppelganger for Aq.
And that's very much a Three Stooges scene. They're literally pulling each other's cues, the long ponytail things that people from that era often wore.
Had to wear,
yeah. So, just to finish the story off so we can actually get talking about it. So, he's a low-life buffoon for about the first half to 2/3 of the story. The last third to possibly a half of the story, there are rumors of a revolution from the city. It's just a city nearby. It's not given a name. And some of the richer elements in the Weizhuang village are involved, rumored to be involved. Aq wants in on this. Why? Because in his mind, revolution means a chance to overthrow everything and get whatever you want.
Well, the richer elements are involved in the sense that they're the targets of the revolution, right?
Right, but there are wealthier elements trying to figure out what to do with the revolution as well. The guy comes back to the village at one point, for example, with his queue cut off. And Aq starts making fun of him, and he ends up being one of the ringleaders. Yeah. So Aq wants to join in the revolution because he figures this is a way to get what he wants and get rid of people he doesn't like. But whenever he tries to approach people he thinks are involved, he gets in trouble and eventually gets arrested, gets taken to the city.
He gets arrested because he was talking about revolution, but he doesn't know anything about revolution.
Right. And so he gets taken to the city. He gets questioned, interrogated, thrown in jail, and throughout, he doesn't know what's going on. And then at the end, he's shot. And that's the end of the story. What forms the shell of, to me, what is most fascinating about the story is the question of why a person who in the beginning of the story is a complete idiot, not just idiot, but lowlife, by the end of the story,
why are we sympathetic?
We're deeply sympathetic with him. And the moment of his execution is, I'll say it, a brilliant piece of literature.
I agree.
It's absolutely 100%. Brilliant. We'll talk about that in a second.
Yeah.
But first of all, we start off with the narrator introducing Aq.
And that's an incredibly interesting passage.
Yeah. Why is it interesting to you?
So I think it's interesting to me because this is the part where I guess if you had the rest of the story, it could kind of be interpreted in this sort of hack writer way, as this communist, sympathetic, whatever story. But with this first part, I don't think you can do anything with that as far as, like, if you take him only to be a hack writer, it's just like you have to forget about this first chapter. The Lu Xun, the narrator, who is sort of maybe a Lu Xun-like character, is really fascinating because he starts out talking about he's going to write this biography about a guy whose name he doesn't know.
Right.
And he doesn't know even how to classify this. We use the word in English biography, but that doesn't really capture what's going on in Chinese. And in Chinese, he spends about a paragraph trying to decide what to call this type of biography. It can't be called an official history. It can't be called an unofficial history. It can't be called a biography because it's he's not important enough. That's one of the things that's so revolutionary about this whole story is it's about a guy who's a nobody.
Yeah.
Why would you write about a nobody?
And specifically this term, zhengzhuan, which literally means an official biography, and it's a recognized genre in Chinese writing. This isn't just...
This dates back several thousand years.
Yeah, it's,
2,000 years at least.
And so it's this kind of a parody as well, because, like you say, he's writing about someone that should never have even an unofficial biography written about him. But he has one. And the narrator begins by really going deeply into this convention and basically laying out for us all the reasons that this project shouldn't be happening. He doesn't know the name. He doesn't know. No one knows where he comes from, who his family is.
Doesn't know anything about his history.
Doesn't know anything about his history. So, in the beginning, it's actually in some ways kind of funny, because if you open an official biography and the person says, well, actually, we don't really know anything about him, but I've really, and the narrator says, I've really wanted to write about this guy for like 2 years. I've been obsessed with the idea.
And you say it's funny. I would actually suggest maybe the right word is disturbing, almost, particularly for a Chinese reader at this time. You've got all of this like 2,000 years worth of zhengzhuan that is about people who are important, and then to suddenly suggest like I'm going to write a story about a nobody whose name I don't even really know.
And part of this
is kind of disconcerting and like like it just shakes your world.
And part of this, though, I know that Lu Xun did this on purpose, because Lu Xun and a lot of writers who were part of what was called the May 4th movement, 1919.
Which this is the representational piece.
This and Diary of a Madman, Kuang Ren日记, sort of the Big Bang. I guess they would call it this movie, sort of, as much as anything can be that for a literary movement. But they were reading not the Chinese classics necessarily, but people like Emile Zola and Tolstoy and Turgenev and people who were writing very realistic psychological literature. When I say psychological, I mean literally you're exploring the psyches of characters. And there had been vernacular literature before this. Lee and I have been reading a lot of Mingqing vernacular stories. They're extremely vernacular.
In some ways, they're easier to understand than a lot of the vernacular of this period.
I prefer the vernacular of this period. I think the plot... Well, we'll save that for a different discussion. Yeah. Lee and I are going to have a whole podcast at one point discussing this, because the claim in mainland China, in academic circles and most other places, is that colloquial vernacular literature starts in 1919 with with Kuang Ren日记, Diary of a Madman. But when you read older, what's called Huaben, we've got several of those literature on the podcast website. There's nothing high or snooty about it. In some ways, it's very low.
It's quite,
Anyway.
For another discussion.
Exactly. But again, what's interesting is this, in all of those cases, there's something to write about, right? It's not the characters so much as the story. This is the reverse. Now you have a completely character-centered story, based on a nobody.
Right. How do you do that?
Exactly. And so the narrator, the opening convention is, we don't know anything about him.
Well, we should first say, actually, I think that's a great point. We should first say, in every Chinese biography, there is a convention. You talk about what a person's name is and what their different names are, because there are various kinds of names in Chinese literature. You talk about where they're from. So it's really fantastically revolutionary to say, I don't actually know this guy's name. I don't know where he's from. I don't know who he's from.
And even more so, you're going to construct that
through the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, all narrative to some extent does that anyway. Mm-hmm. There's no direct representation of a mind, right? But that you would even seek to construct it at all. I mean, if this person doesn't already have these qualifications, they don't deserve to be written about in classical Chinese fiction. Here, someone is saying, this is someone I'm going to choose to construct. Their mind I'm going to construct, even though there's no particular reason to do so, because there's some sort of need felt by Lu Xun, the writer, for people that no one thinks about and no one cares about to be given print space. Now, what's fascinating, though, again, this is why Lu Xun is so complicated. Fair enough, you've got that. You would think, if that was your goal, even if you made this person a buffoon, they would eventually become a hero somehow. Mm-hmm. But when we get to the second half or so of the story, what characterizes Akyu?
It's pretty unheroic.
Extremely unheroic.
But it's extremely sympathetic, like we said.
Yeah. And that is, again, this is fascinating because what marks the second half of the story is Akyu's downfall, essentially. But his downfall is what brings us into his circle, his life.
So you don't think we could have been sympathetic with him if he hadn't had this downfall?
I don't know. It's a good question, but I don't see anything else redeeming him.
I agree with you. I think it's pretty tough to think of, to be sympathetic with him.
Lu Xun intentionally presents us with the most buffoonish, low-life character he can, and then redeems him at the end. And in the end, essentially, he's put on trial and he's questioned about something he knows nothing about. And for me, that's when my sympathy begins. Partly because I've lived in China. I lived in China in the mainland for 10 years.
That's a decade.
That's a decade.
We're keeping count.
Exactly. And by the way, I should say this just in case there are people listening who are from Taiwan and Hong Kong. I say mainland China because I can't not. It's a reflex now. When you live in the mainland, if you say Taiwan and China, it doesn't matter where you are, you're in trouble. And so my apologies if there are any listeners from Taiwan who were like, why does he keep saying mainland as though like we're a part of this?
And I say China and Taiwan because although I did live in China for some period of time, I also lived in Taiwan. And if you say mainland China, you get some looks.
You're not liked. So my apologies if this slips out this way. This is just the terminology I'm used to using. So anyway, but so what begins the sympathy for me is when he doesn't know what's happening. And if you've lived in the mainland and you've met enough people from the quote-unquote lower classes, farmers, migrant workers, and I've met and talked with a lot, this is not an unheard of thing. A good friend of mine, my best friend when I was getting a master's degree there, we were talking. He grew up in a coal mining town.
Shanxi.
Yeah, out in Shanxi. Nasty, nasty coal mining area. And we were talking about, unrest in the countryside. He said, what's disturbing is that, and we talked about, this was like a conversation 4 or 5 years ago. He said, what's disturbing is that for even just the people I know in these rural areas, for them, a revolution or even reform equals violence. You cannot overturn things without violence and bloodshed.
And you think that's what's kind of what we're seeing here in the story?
He was my friend in China was a huge reader of Lu Xun as well. And maintained that one of the things Lu Xun was troubled by with the sort of the peasantry, the rural population, was this notion that revolution equaled violence. There was no way to peacefully reform the culture of the people. It had to be blood. And he parodies this a little bit with Akyu because there's a scene this was the scene I remember reading in Chinese for the first time that made me laugh out loud. It's Akyu lying awake in his little room in the temple, the local temple, which is where you can sleep. It's kind of like their version of a YMCA or something.
Yeah. It's almost like a homeless shelter.
Yeah. He's lying awake at night going, all right, so the revolution's coming. So who am I going to kill first? Well,
who am I going to get back? Who am I going to get rid of?
This guy's going to die. His wife, I might take his wife, but she's not very hot. So maybe I'll do, this might work.
So revolution becomes almost just, for IQ, it's essentially just a way to satisfy material and sexual desires.
Yeah, and he has no knowledge of the broader political implications. He doesn't even know what it is.
Right.
And this becomes apparent as he's questioned, and they're asking, you know, what are you involved in? Who's in charge of this? And he's kind of like,
Do you think that the people questioning him, they clearly are just trying to sort of blame something on someone? But do you think they actually know that he didn't know anything?
I have no idea. It's a good question.
I'm not so sure. He was... So before, in, I guess, chapters 7 and 8, he was talking about revolution and shooting his mouth off, essentially, claiming that he knew something about revolution.
Right. Even though he knows nothing about it. And these people have to know he's a buffoon.
Yeah.
But they're still looking for sort of a scapegoat.
Yeah. And he becomes that scapegoat 100%.
He becomes that scapegoat 100%. But the end of the story is he's asked this a number of different times, what do you know? Tell us what you know. And every single time he says, essentially, I don't know what you're talking about. Or, I don't know. Over and over again, I don't know. Mm-hmm. I don't know. And then at the very end, he's being taken out to be shot, and there's this fascinating sequence. I mean, literally just a fascinating sequence.
Probably one of the most fascinating sequences in all of modern China.
I would agree.
One of the most famous.
All due respect to C.T. Xian, his camp. But he's being driven out to be shot, and along the way, he's thinking to himself, I wonder if I'm going out to be executed. And he says to himself, well, I figure at some point everyone has to die. Right? Everyone's going to die. I mean, there's an execution here and there, so whatever. You know, he's sort of resigned to his fate. He knows he can't do anything about it.
And the language, I think, is fantastic. The language of that resignation is really interesting.
It makes it very clear that he's resigned, but it's not played for sort of melodramatic effect.
Yeah.
He's just resigned. The language is resigned.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's this moment when he's being lined up to be shot, and the narrator, who does not use much of what we call quoted monologue or even interior monologue here. It happens once or twice in the story. Here we get a vision from Akyu's past. Now, usually when you use interior monologue or quoted interior monologue, you get someone thinking about what's happening right then. So-and-so is thinking to himself, why is this happening to me? Here, it's a memory. It's a memory of Akyu's from when he was being chased by wolves. And he remembers the howling, the mouths splayed open and the blood-curdling cries and all that. And as he's looking at the crowd...
And the crowd is looking at him equally.
Yeah, he's reminded of this pack of wolves that has been after him.
And the language that is used to talk about those eyes, and I think he uses the word hungry eyes.
Yeah, he uses the word hungry eyes, I believe. And then at that moment, you have a phrase. It's in quotation marks. There's no end quote. There's no introduction that says he said.
There is quotation marks, but no end quote.
There is a quotation mark. Now, when you see quotation marks in the text, it usually means someone is speaking. The narrator is assuming someone is making an utterance or thinking.
Can I read that passage out?
The whole thing?
Okay? Well, just those two sentences.
Okay.
So here's the passage. So this is the whole thing. 这些眼睛们似乎连成一气，已经在哪里要他灵魂救命. So 救命 in Chinese literally means save life, save my life, help me. And that first passage was these eyes almost like they came together in one thing. They were already there chewing on his soul.
Yeah.
Save my life.
Yeah.
Save me.
But in the very next line is Akyu didn't say this, or didn't speak.
然而 Akyu 没有说.
And that's such a fascinating thing to say because
who is that
exactly
voice
at that moment of Jiuming, although we assume it's Akyu, the actual text doesn't let you say for sure it's Akyu because the very next line is he didn't speak. Is it the narrator crying out for Akyu?
Is it Akyu? Is it saying that Akyu, after he said, save us, save me, said, he didn't speak after that? It's not really clear.
I think for me it's pretty clear that the male shua means he didn't speak, at all. But that's how I read it.
Okay.
But regardless, you have this moment that's, what do you do with it?
Yeah.
the story has been leading up to this moment, this execution. I mean, in some ways, it couldn't have gone any other way. Someone this ridiculous in the middle of a revolution is just not going to end up well, right? And so this is why the desire to make Lu Xun, for example, a revolutionary, right, doesn't really work here. This character is too complex, and this particular moment too strange for it to simply be a revolutionary rallying cry. Now, one of the sort of the party approved ways to read this is that this is someone who's just been taken advantage of by the old sort of feudal system. And that's why he's able to be wiped out, because he hasn't been taught, he doesn't know his own culture, he's just been deprived of everything by the old feudal system and just killed. But that's a very tricky, I don't think it's very hard to read the story that way.
I guess that is a valid interpretation to a certain degree, but it's certainly not the only one. And it's maybe not the most intuitive.
Right, and I think it does Lu Xun especially disservice when you read the story. Absolutely. It's that superficial.
Yeah. But I think most kind of communist-approved readings are too superficial.
But I still keep coming back to that final moment and thinking that we are sympathetic to a character who in the beginning of the story we hated, or at the very least think he's a clown, and ends up being a target of a focused, incredible, tragic heft.
We should say this. I mean, there's this weird narrative arc that you're talking about, but it starts out with us actually not knowing who he is. We don't know anything about him. We don't know his name. And then we come to hate him. And then we come to cry about his death.
Yeah.
That takes some real writerly ability, I think.
And I think that is a lot of what is, if you want to use the word revolutionary, about Lu Xun. Is he's using literature, he's using his writing craft in a way where people that have no inherent value on their own, in fact, people who should frankly just be cast out of any sort of responsible society, can be brought in. It's a reconciliatory tool. It is not a tool for heroizing here. He never becomes a hero. At no point do you go, wow, what a great person, or he looks like he might win. I hope he wins. As he's being led off, you're sort of nodding, like, well, it's kind of what I figured would happen at some point. And yet, in this moment, the narrative craft, brings him in to the circle. This is what humanizes him. This literature is what breaks down what he would think of as a sort of feudal, aristocracy or bureaucracy. Is the actual craft of writing.
It's a very humanistic argument that you've come up with.
Well, I'm at heart nothing if not a humanist. No, I just when you read enough of Lu Xun, this is a very common thing. This belief that writing can serve this purpose. Now, and we'll talk about it another time, but this sort of not idealistic goal, because of who he's bringing in, he's aware is still on the outside in the real world. But he will eventually burn out on this. He doesn't write fiction for many years. Lu Xun eventually gets to a point where he begins writing things like, fiction cannot possibly capture the magnitude of the horrors and the things we're seeing. It can't. Which is what leads to Wild Grass, Yetzal, which is a series of prose poems, very abstract, very strange, that we will definitely discuss at some point because they're totally fascinating.
Do you have any concluding thoughts on this?
Just that it is, as I said before, you cannot overestimate the importance of this story and of Lu Xun for mainland Chinese people. If you're trying to understand modern Chinese culture, politics, you pretty much have to read this story. You don't necessarily have to enjoy the story, but it's literally that important. This figure is a giant in 20th century Chinese culture, and it can teach you a lot, this story and the study of Lu Xun in general, about how, as China was becoming a very modern, or a more modern state, how artists and writers conceived of their own culture and the contradictions and the problems in
Awesome. I think that's a good way to end it. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.